Pittsburgh Steelers fans, welcome to another edition of the Steelers Sunday Night Q&A. It's Jeremy Betts here with you to talk all things Pittsburgh Steelers, and we're going to really kind of focus in tonight on maybe how the Steelers roster is currently constructed, a little bit about their strengths and weaknesses, and to do that with me and also to answer your questions, it's my good buddy Bradley Locker. Bradley, welcome into the show, man. I'm glad you're able to join me. It's been a while since I've had you on a show. It's been a while since we've talked, but been reading your stuff and listening to your stuff. I'm sure you've been busy with tournament ball and everything too. How's it going?
Yeah, thanks so much, Jeremy, for having me on. Always a pleasure talking ball with you. And yes, it has been very busy in the Northwestern world of things. I'm sure you're watching March Madness earlier today.
Yep.
A little bit slower as we transition into the spring, which is good. But it's always a fantastic time of year. The draft is under a month away, and I know we're both super amped about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I know once you get to April, right, it just kind of all starts to go into focus. And I know you pay attention to not just players and prospects, but also how the teams across the league are kind of focusing in on these guys. And you start to see a real narrowing down as teams bring in their top 30 visits and guys start to progress through pro days, who shows up for those, who takes interest. Is there anything that stands out to you about the Steelers in their pro day visits? I know Michael Penix Jr. was a topic of conversation this last week, kind of a surprise that the Steelers maybe sent a contingent over there to watch him and or having him in for a visit. That's what it was, not go out to his pro day necessarily. But anything that stands out to you as far as pro day visits or top 30 visits that excites you about the Steelers?
I think one thing that's clear, dating even back to the combine and interest there, is that it's pretty obvious to me that the Steelers are going to take a receiver very early in this draft, whether it's in the first round or second round. I would be very surprised if Pittsburgh did not take a receiver by the 51st overall pick, which is their second round pick. Just given the roster construction on the team right now, George Pickens, the only receiver I think anybody remotely trusts on this team. Van Jefferson and Quez Watkins and maybe Cordero Patterson, if you consider him a receiver, they're fine depth pieces, but you're not really counting on any of those guys to pick up a big first down for you or to go beat a Denzel Ward down the field if you need to win a game against the Browns, for example. So with Pickens kind of solidified as the X receiver on this team, I think the Steelers definitely need a Z, maybe still need a Y receiver. And bringing in a guy like I think Ricky Pearsall had a top 30 visit. The Steelers showed a lot of interest in Rome Odunze in Indianapolis. Now, I'm not saying the Steelers are going to trade up for a receiver because I think that is not the wisest move, even if there's a top three of Marvin Harrison Jr., Odunze, and Malik Neighbors. And boy, it would be fun to have one of those guys wearing the black and gold. But I think this team has too many other needs and understands that this receiver class is incredibly deep. So I don't expect to trade up, but I would not be surprised if receiver were very much in play at 20. I've started kind of trying to do some homework on some guys I think could be there. And one guy I like a lot is Adonai Mitchell out of Texas. We could talk more about him and why I think he's a good fit. But I think the pro day visits and the interest so far kind of reaffirms that to me, that the Steelers are pretty intent on taking a receiver in some ways because they've kind of forced themselves to with how they've approached free agency.
Yeah, they have. And I think that in a way it's calculated because of the depth and class of this wide receiver group this year. I think that you start to walk into this draft setting and you feel pretty confident that deep into day two, you can get starting caliber wide receivers for your roster. And the Pittsburgh Steelers have a unique opportunity with their needs and the strengths of this class to really add starting type guys, year one starting type guys in the first couple rounds of the draft, maybe even the first 3 rounds. And they've got 4 picks there. It's very interesting to see how this will all play out. And I do want to get your take on Adonai Mitchell because as someone who's kind of brushed over all of these guys and maybe not dove into any one guy except my favorite guys, maybe like Jalen McMillan. I really like him out of Washington. Rome Odunze out of Washington as well. And then Roman Wilson. Those guys are kind of my favorite receivers in this class. But Adonai Mitchell, very intriguing. I've always viewed him as an X receiver, though. You kind of think he would have more to his game, though.
Yeah, I think he would. I got the chance to watch him a few days ago and just pulling up my notes now. I think the things that really stand out, he's an amazing route runner, has a pretty deep route tree, and he kind of leverages different releases at the line. He stacks cornerbacks well, but he's really fluid hips, and I think that stands out when you watch him on outbreaking routes or vertical routes. He's just kind of smooth overall as a lateral mover. And I think he can really kind of bend routes even as they progress in the route tree. And or I guess as the route moves further down the field. I think that's another strength of his. And I really like his late hands too. He can adjust to the ball really late. He can track the ball with really high accuracy. And I think also he's a pretty good blocker as well, collectively, even though, I mean, receiver blocking can kind of have different weights to certain people. But I really like Mitchell. He was a high profile player at Texas this past year. And I think he could definitely be an intriguing option for the Steelers at 20. I know he's a little bit bigger, so I could see him being kind of an X receiver, as you said, but I feel like with his capabilities of route running, I think that would kind of complement what the Steelers have in Pickens, who's much more of a vertical threat. Somebody like Mitchell could attack the middle of the field and the outside portions of the field a little bit better.
Yeah, and Arthur Smith has been known to target the bigger receivers. I mean, he doesn't mind having towering duos on the outside. You saw it in Atlanta, even if you include the tight ends in that. And then, Tennessee, A.J. Brown, he's not the tallest receiver, but still a big receiver, likes those kind of guys to kind of round out his roster. So I like it. And one thing I really do love about A.D. Mitchell is the fact that he just looks effortless in the way he plays, and also can turn it up a notch when needed as well. Hit an extra gear, get down the field. So a very well-rounded player, honestly, and a guy that would be very intriguing to me at 20, especially if you start to consider the tackles are gone. Maybe you want a center as your next one. You know that there's going to be somebody there at 51, whether that's Frazier or Cedric Van Pran, or maybe even a little bit later, you could go get a guy like Tanner Bortolini. I know somebody you're probably familiar with, being in the Big Ten, guy out of Wisconsin. So let's get to some questions here, Bradley, before we get into what our topic was going to be a little bit later. Let's answer some of these and drive some conversation here. Paranormal in the Funhouse says, I have some questions when you guys start your Q&A. Do you think we are going to make another splash free agent pickup before the draft starts? Bradley, I'll open this up to you. Anything sneaking in here for the Steelers late?
I think I'd be a little surprised. I feel like the Steelers have already kind of made a few splash moves this offseason. I think Justin Fields is probably the biggest one, or maybe even Russell Wilson. And the Steelers are not really known to make a lot of headline generating moves in the offseason and free agency in the first place, kind of some smarter, solid pickups. And we saw that even the last week with Dean Lowry, who I think is a good rotational defensive end, and Cordero Patterson, who should have an even more important role this upcoming NFL season with the NFL adopting the XFL style kickoff. And I know Patterson wasn't as good last year, the last 2 years in kick returns, but I think there's probably still a little bit of juice left there. So I thought that was a good move. But I mean, the Steelers are listed as having $14 million in cap space and over the cap. And there are some high caliber free agents out there. I did tweet, I think yesterday, that Stephon Gilmore is a guy I think would be a great fit in Pittsburgh to mentor Joey Porter Jr. And I'm pretty surprised he's still unsigned. I know he is, I believe, 32 or 33, but he was good for Dallas last year, was good in Indianapolis the year before that. He's shown that he can still play at a high level, even though he's on the older side for cornerbacks. So maybe the Steelers sign a guy like Gilmore, or Xavier Howard is still out there. Justin Simmons feels like it's probably too high up the wish list, given Deshaun Elliott was signed. So I'd be a little surprised if the Steelers took some more big swings, but it's not impossible, I guess. The resources are definitely there to do it. I just think the Steelers are probably transitioning to the draft a little bit at this point.
Yeah, I definitely agree with strategically. I think the focus is now the draft. Whether they add in some roster filling pieces in the meantime remains to be seen. I think we also have to consider that once the draft concludes and teams add players, there's another kind of mini round of cuts, and teams go through some of their other salary dumps and things like that for players that they've now replaced with younger prospects in the draft. And so the Steelers probably have a chance, even at that point, a better idea of where their cap situation stands, maybe the chance to restructure a couple guys, extend Cam Hayward, something like that, to really improve that number. And then maybe they can go get a couple guys. I wanted to bring this one up here. It kind of corresponds. Daniel Red says, I'm sorry. I got mixed up here. We'll go back to you, Daniel. Greg Hokie says, what do you think of bringing in a free agent center Brian Allen on a team-friendly deal before the draft? This makes sense to me. Bradley, are you a fan of Brian Allen? I know there's kind of mixed reviews out there. There were some Rams fans that I've talked to who were like, yeah, we're not going to really miss him. I think we can probably upgrade on this. But, I mean, Mason Cole being the standard of what the latest Mason Cole, Kendrick Green being the standard of what we've seen in Pittsburgh recently. Is Brian Allen an upgrade on that potentially?
I think he probably would be a slight upgrade. The issue with him has kind of just been staying on the field. He only has played a little over 400 snaps the last 2 years, but his PFF grades have been kind of in the mid 60s. I wouldn't mind Allen as kind of a stopgap option. I think when the Steelers signed Mason Cole, that's what everybody thought he was going to be. Everybody thought, okay, this guy is going to be a solid backup piece, a solid kind of interior offensive lineman, but you didn't want him to start for you. And that's when Cole got the starting nod and then kept it for so long. That's kind of where things went wrong. I think Allen as a backup or a mentor to a young center is probably the ideal play. And I think it's definitely plausible for sure. Center is pretty, I think easily, we're talking about, the strengths and weaknesses of the roster. I think that's pretty easily the weakest position on the Steelers roster. I don't think there's a starting caliber center on this roster. Some people say Nate Herbig or James Daniels. I'm not really in favor of either one of them starting at center. Daniels has been a really good right guard for the last 2 years. I don't really know why you would disrupt that when you could just draft a center in the first 2 or 3 rounds or even sign a guy like Allen. So I think Allen for sure could be in play.
Do you think that there is a higher probability this year in that first round of a trade back for the Steelers than maybe we've seen because of the positions they're targeting? Wide receiver, center. I mean, there's a potential there that you could gain a couple picks and still get a player that maybe you're still like, if you're going Zach Frazier anywhere in the first round, that might be considered a reach. But if you're doing it closer to pick 30, that feels a little better, right? Than maybe at 20 or Joey Porter Jr. or not Joey Porter Jr. or Jackson Powers Johnson. I get my JPJs mixed up, Bradley.
Yep, me too.
Yeah. So, do you see maybe that could be in the cards for the Steelers this year? I know, obviously, Omar Khan's going to say we're open to all possibilities. He's openly said that, but that's not been something the Steelers have done. Is that something you could see being a little more in play this year?
Well, you did allude to it with Omar Khan. I feel like the thing we've learned about him as a general manager for 2 years is that nothing is off the table. Nothing is out of play. Trading Kenny Pickett, entering his 3rd year, nobody had that happening whatsoever. He moved up the draft board for Broderick Jones. So I think the draft, certainly you have to consider any type of option. I would be a little surprised if the Steelers traded down. I just think they have pretty significant needs at this stage in their roster building. I talked about center, I talked about receiver. Even if a tackle like Amarius Mims from Georgia were still there at 20, I don't really see the Steelers passing him up. So I think the teams that are going to trade down are probably a little higher that don't necessarily need a star receiver right away, or they feel like their roster isn't super close to being playoff ready. But the Steelers are probably only a few pieces away from feeling like they're in a pretty good spot. And I think if you move further down the draft, you're missing out on a guy like Powers Johnson, who I think would be a good target at 20 and actually a fantastic pick if he were still there. Some people think he could even go higher than that. So I think if Jackson Powers Johnson is off the board at 20 and the Steelers don't love any of the receivers available, if Mitchell's off the board too, then I could definitely see a trade back. But otherwise, I feel like I'm kind of expecting the Steelers to, at the very least, pick at 20, if not earlier.
Yeah. I could see that trade up scenario. I personally could see that if you start to see, there's been a lot of talk about Rome Odunze being the prize of or the apple of the Steelers' eye. I don't know if they're going to be willing to move up as far as it would take to get him. I think he's gone before pick 10. But if for some reason he were to slide towards 10 or drop out of that top 10 altogether, I think that you could definitely see the Steelers move up for a guy like that. Maybe to just make sure they get their tackle. They might move up. I got some pushback on that on X over the last week, thinking that a deep position, obviously offensive tackle, there's probably going to be one of those guys at 20. I don't know. I think I think the Steelers would, if they want their pick of maybe those last couple guys, then maybe they move up. But if you want the leftovers at 20, that's probably what's going to be there, unless you want to reach a little bit for a guy like Tyler Guyton or Jordan Morgan or something along those lines at tackle. We'll see how that plays out, Bradley. I think it's going to be a super intriguing draft. The thing that makes this just a huge wild card draft is the fact that the quarterbacks are high profile players this year, more so than the last few years. And you've got legit 4 guys that could go in the top 4 with trades and whatnot. So you're going to automatically see talented ball players pushed back down the draft board. And that sets up well for where the Steelers are at. And I think honestly sets up well for really everybody in that top 20 or so. There's going to be a lot of maneuvering, maybe more trades than we've seen in a good while in the draft. We'll see how it plays out. Let's take a quick break here for our audio-only audience. If you're here with us live, we're not going anywhere. Bradley and I will be back right after this. And we are back here on the Steelers Sunday night Q&A. I hope you all had a fantastic Easter Sunday, had a restful time, and we will continue our conversation here now on the Pittsburgh Steelers and their roster. We've got some good questions here on hold, and I wanted to go back to the receiver situation with a couple questions that came in a little bit earlier. And I haven't gotten from you. I don't recall seeing a true read on the trade from Deontay Johnson to gain Dante Jackson. Were you in favor of the move? Is that a move that you could see haunting the Steelers this year, potentially losing a receiver of Johnson's caliber with or without maybe some of the on-field lapses at times?
I mean, the first word that kind of came into my mind when I saw this trade was pretty much why. Why did the Steelers want to just give up Deontay Johnson, especially for such a low cost? I mean, I do understand the thinking behind it. He was going to be a free agent at the end of the year. There were certainly, as you alluded to, some strange occurrences from Johnson, whether it was backtracking on a route after the ball was in his hands or some outbursts and things like that. And that just kind of comes with, I think, an NFL type of receiver. The diva receiver is a very real thing in the NFL, but Johnson is pretty much a really, really good receiver, no matter which statistic you look at, separation metrics, yak metrics. Of course, the drops have been up and down throughout his career, but I think Johnson was a really good complement to what Pickens offered. And when in trading Johnson, to me, it created a need that the Steelers did not have before this happened. And now that they have to desperately try to fill, which is why I was very much opposed to the move. And I think there is a due chance that the Steelers could be haunted by this move. Now, if you get somebody, you trade up for a Dunze, I don't know if you're going to be too sad about moving on from Johnson. And a younger receiver will have a newer contract life per se, will be a lot cheaper than Johnson would have been. So I get it from that perspective, but I did not really like the Johnson trade. And yes, I think there's a good chance the Steelers will end up missing Johnson unless he wasn't really planned to be integrated well into Smith's offense.
Yeah, it was very surprising to me. I'll say that. Now, I'm a bigger Dante Jackson fan than maybe some are, so I thought the return was a little bit better than, I think you get a starting caliber cornerback in the trade. And now what you've done to your offense might be a problem, but I also kind of envision an offensive unit that likes to push the ball downfield a lot more. I think Pat Freiermuth kind of becomes I think he's an important piece in this conversation about the pass catching room, because you kind of, with the offensive coordinator hire of Arthur Smith, you already bump him up a little bit based on how Smith uses tight ends and likes to target the middle of the field. Now, whether the quarterbacks are going to play into that, that's going to be an interesting conversation as the season progresses too. But Pat Freiermuth plays into this from the pass catcher angle because you've got a talented guy who can kind of be, I don't know, he can kind of be your Y, he can be your split end and have a role like that up the seams, and I think in the screen game too, I think is going to be a big role for him. But I think now you have a chance, if you're the Steelers, to really add a complementary piece to that. And that's why I think for all of the Rome Odunze talk or, things like that, I think Roman Wilson is kind of their ideal target with the route running ability, kind of that smaller, quicker receiver. But I think Wilson's just a very physical player too. He kind of gives 100% on every play. Maybe the Steelers kind of looking for an attitude shift in that regard too. So we'll see how it plays out. I do think they will miss Deontay Johnson for what he does as making life easier for his quarterback, because you kind of just know he's going to get open. Whether you end up throwing the ball there or not, is outside the point. But he's just kind of, if anybody was a security blanket for the quarterback, it was Deontay Johnson, because he just was a separator. And it's not a stretch to say one of the top 3 or 4 or 5 separators in the league. And when you have a guy who's that good at one thing, you're going to miss him when you lose him. So I do think that plays in here. And then going back to Daniel Red's comment here. I think we should address this because I think early on in the process here, in the offseason process, if you're kind of just not just tuning in, but if you're kind of just getting in the swing of things, you might be thinking, wide receiver's not that big of a deal for the Steelers. We need offensive line. We need defensive tackle. We need a cornerback. But really at this point, I think you're right. 51, I'd be surprised if there's not a new wideout on this roster by 51. Definitely using one of their third round picks at the very latest on a wide receiver. But if I were a betting man on this topic specifically, I would say that second round pick is almost guaranteed to be a wide receiver, especially when you talk about the guys that they've been focusing on and bringing in for talks. Is there any way that you get out of day 2 without a receiver here, Bradley?
I mean, I would be absolutely floored. I talked about it earlier, but let's just break down the Steelers receiver room for a second. It's George Pickens, and then a massive drop off. And then it's Calvin Austin III, who really had a very underwhelming year last year. Maybe it was Matt Canada and Eddie Faulkner, Matt Sullivan not really using him, Mike Sullivan, I should say, using him as much as people expected. But Austin had a very disappointing season last year. You can't count on him to be anything more than he was last year. He really didn't play his first year in the NFL. He's probably still trying to get acclimated. So you have Austin, Van Jefferson, and Quez Watkins. I mean, those guys are fringe wide receiver 3 types. There's no solid wide receiver 2 on this roster. And it's pretty much malpractice to go into a new NFL season with George Pickens as the only receiver that any defensive back and any defensive coordinator needs to be afraid of. You brought in 2 new quarterbacks. I think a lot of credit has to go to Omar Khan in this front office for trying to rebuild this offense, recognizing what we did the last 2 to 3 years is not acceptable. We need to try to change the approach. But to have one receiver would be very antithetical to that. And that's why you talked about a guy like Wilson or Xavier Legette out of South Carolina, who I think I'm a little lower on than a lot of people, but he could still do some good things for an offense. Or a guy like Mitchell or a Brian Thomas from LSU. I just think that in the modern NFL predicated on the passing game and trying to, especially with Arthur Smith and play action. And he has been a run heavy guy in the past for sure, but I think the Steelers run game is going to be good, but what's going to be of the passing game? And if Pickens is the only guy that Smith can really scheme anything up for, I don't think it's going to be a very successful season altogether. So, I mean, positional value-wise, the last few years in the NFL have shown that, yes, you can find very talented receivers late. Just look at Puka Nacua on the Rams last year. Maybe he's the exception, but in a draft this late, there could probably be a receiver taken in the 4th or 5th round that could see meaningful snaps and maybe even start late in the 2024 season. But if I'm the Steelers, I don't want to take that gamble. I'd rather get my guy early and know that, okay, I've at least filled out my receiver room. And there are big needs still on this roster: center, cornerback, tackle. You talked about it, but I feel like receiver is one of the top 2 or 3 needs on this football team, and it just can't be ignored anymore.
Yeah, I agree. You don't have a do-it-all receiver on this roster. You just don't. You've got even George Pickens, for all the good he brings to your team. He's not going to be running a bunch of comebacks and like highly I'm struggling with the word, but like these deep routes that are just that are hard to, complex routes is what I'm trying to say. He's not going to be able to do that. And so you're looking at a guy who's, yes, improving in that regard, but still he's a vertical receiver. And that's what he is. Van Jefferson is a vertical receiver. Calvin Austin is, he could be your underneath receiver, but can he hold up in a larger role than what he has at his size? Those are all big questions. Quez Watkins, a deep threat. These are all role guys, and you need a do-it-all type guy in this room. Absolutely. All right, let's get to a question kind of going with our theme of the show. What are the current strengths and weaknesses of the Steelers roster? I think you look at, obviously, edge rusher. You've got 3 really good guys there, and the ability to add a 4th one in Marcus Golden, who's still a free agent that you had last year, maybe even Bud Dupree. There's been talks about that. So I think that position will get figured out, and it looks to be in good shape, as opposed to maybe some previous years where you had some concerns about that position behind TJ Watt and whoever the second guy was, whether that's Alex Highsmith, Bud Dupree in the past as well. So I like that position. I think that the offensive line has a chance to be a good unit if you can add that one last piece to it. But I mean, Bradley, there's kind of something you could be concerned about with every room, Running back looks pretty good. I mean, you've got two really good running backs, and now you've got Cordero Patterson, who can fill in for either one of those guys in a role for a few games if needed. Talking Najee Harris or Jaylen Warren, I think that's a really good room for the Steelers too. There's definitely some weak positions. So Joseph asked this question: how long do you think it will take players to gel as a team, considering new offensive coordinator, so many new players it's going to be? That's a great question because we haven't really talked about that a lot. We've just talked about Omar Khan gets in these quarterbacks. Omar Khan gets in the safety and the corner and kind of changes this roster up. But it's a lot of new. And we even saw with the Ravens last year, the first few weeks of the season, new offensive coordinator. The offense struggled a little bit. They finally got on their horse. They were really playing well to the end of the season and played in an AFC championship game. But it's not going to be all roses. There's going to be some thorns in here, Bradley. Do you see Mike Tomlin kind of transcending that and helping this team gel a little bit faster than maybe other teams, or do you think that this could be a problem heading into the season?
I think I'd probably put it somewhere in the middle. I fully expect there will probably be a transition and adjustment period, just given how many different moving pieces you have, as you talked about. So you have, first of all, a new offensive coordinator who is a fully fledged offensive coordinator, unlike what the Steelers have had pretty much the last 3 to 4 years. But there are also going to be existing players on the roster who have to adjust to what Smith wants to do. So in terms of running style, Smith has more of a wide zone, outside zone scheme. The Steelers and Najee Harris and Jaylen Warren, they're used to hitting the A gap, the B gap on inside zones, split zones. So that's going to be a change and something that's going to have to be drilled a lot in training camp, OTAs, the preseason, all that type of stuff. And of course, there's now a revitalized receiver room. George Pickens, his role could probably be about the same, running more vertical routes, goes, comebacks, curls, things like that. He kind of fits that mold of what Drake London was or A.J. Brown was in this Arthur Smith offense. But you're going to add most likely a rookie receiver who's going to have to shoulder a lot of the weight right in his rookie year. You have two new quarterbacks, one of whom, or kind of both of whom, don't entirely fit the approach of Arthur Smith. Russell Wilson does not want to throw over the middle of the field much at all. Smith tries to do that. I think Justin Fields is going to be a big change for him, getting out of Chicago for the first time in his NFL career, learning a new playbook, getting familiar with a new head coaching style, a new locker room, all that type of stuff. So it'd be unrealistic to think the Steelers offense is going to be hitting its stride right away in week 1 or even week 2. And I think there's also a chance we see a quarterback change at some point in this year. If Russell Wilson doesn't get off to a good start, he'll be on his third team in his NFL career after a pretty rocky road in Denver. So I think Steelers fans should probably anticipate that things might not go super smoothly right away, but Mike Tomlin probably understands that too. Omar Khan probably does as well. That's why when he made these changes, he was looking at the long term in his mind and trying to think about week 15, 16, the postseason, all that type of stuff. And if the Steelers are hitting that trajectory by the end of the season, I think it had to be considered a success.
Yeah, and I like this comment from Afton Afored. Thanks for this, Afton. I'm hoping Russ's experience can help the offense fit together better and faster. I think that plays into it. And Mike Tomlin's actually talked about this already. He gives Russell Wilson pole position, right, because of what he can do in preparing the unit throughout the offseason and prepping them for the regular season. Obviously, Justin Fields is going to compete. And I think if you're a Steelers fan, when you're talking about the quarterbacks here, the best thing for the Steelers long-term and even this year would be that Justin Fields absolutely balls out and wins this job outright. Now, if that doesn't happen, then you better hope that Russell Wilson grabs a little bit of that Seattle magic he had from 4 or 5 years ago and can bring that with him. But I mean, this is a 35-year-old quarterback that yes, the experience is there. And I do think that is a boost for the Steelers as far as getting these young guys on the same page. A guy who has always been known as someone who gets in the playbook and understands offense. So that's going to help. He's going to get a hold of this Arthur Smith offense quickly, I think, and be able to translate that and communicate that to these young guys. But outside of that, Bradley, I think you start to look at what's best for the Steelers and what would be the best for their future. The future Justin Fields is that, right? It has to be. And I think, yes, Russ brings this experience, but in the end, you kind of want him to be the stopgap. Honestly, you kind of want him to be just the bridge guy, the guy before the guy. And if that is the case for the Steelers, then Justin Fields could become the future, and that would be a big deal for them. Let's move on to this question here from Claude Bishop. Claude, another one of our fantastic listeners, tunes in almost every show. What's your grade on Omar Khan's first 2 years as GM? Bradley, I'll open it up to you. What you got?
This is a fascinating question. Thank you, Claude, for this, because I think I haven't really considered this so far. I think I'm always just so entrenched in the different moves the Steelers are making, what they could be making, instead of just assessing Khan overall. I think I probably have to give him somewhere in the A- to A range would probably be my rough estimate. I think one thing he's excelled at, and people have pointed this out on social media and other places, is that Khan does a really good job of recognizing when it's time to move on from a player if it has not worked out. Look at Chase Claypool, look at Kenny Pickett. He's not afraid to cut ties with players, and the Steelers were very averse to doing that in the past under Kevin Colbert. I think another area in which he's excelled is getting really good and fair value, if not really superb value, in trading for other GMs. That Claypool trade, getting basically the first-round pick for a receiver who's virtually out of the NFL now, is one of the worst trades that on the terms of the Bears side, one of the worst trades in recent NFL memory. You get a starting caliber cornerback out of Chase Claypool is pretty phenomenal. Getting Justin Fields for a conditional 6th-round pick, that's a lot lower than most people would have expected in late February or even early March. So that was a really good deal. I think there are some moves that Khan maybe has made. The Johnson trade, for example, that I was not a huge fan of. And I think the drafting overall, it's a limited sample size. Broderick Jones looks like he's going to be a solid player, potentially a cornerstone in the offensive line. I think Keanu Benton, Nick Herbig were both good picks. So definitely the jury is still out. I should say that on Khan. And we need to see a more full sample size overall. But I think it's hard to argue with the financial aspect. We kind of knew that was going to be a strong suit of his, given his cap guru background and just kind of having different values in other teams and making sure that the Steelers can come out on top in that regard. So I think generally he's done a pretty good job of addressing the needs on the roster, finding ways to upgrade. But overall, I think it's been a good tenure so far.
Yeah, I'm going to give him an A, but with a big TBD on it, right? I mean, we're 2 years into it, and I was on the Let's Ride podcast with Jeff Hartman on Friday and doing my regular segment with him, and we talked about Omar Khan, and I was pretty set in my assessment that this is something that we're gonna have to revisit in 2 or 3 years, just like we're doing now with Devin Bush and Terrell Edmonds and guys like that, where it's like, okay, the Steelers at the time, you're like, oh, okay, I like this move. I think Kevin Colbert's put together a good roster for the season, and then it didn't pan out, and 4 or 5 years later, you're looking back on it and saying, maybe he kind of actually set back the team a little bit with some of these moves. So obviously right now, I think the Steelers and their fans got kind of a boost from Omar Khan in style. And I think, Bradley, and I think you'll agree with this too, and not a lot of Steelers fans will, but I think you'll agree with me, bringing in more analytics into the field of general managing and acquiring players, adding some more numbers in here is not a bad thing. And Omar Khan, the king of numbers, I think is going to do it in a balanced way where it's not over the top, where you're not relying so much on metrics that you forget about good players, but also where you can get into this new age NFL a little bit, where, I mean, the numbers matter, and you have to be able to play that ball game if you're going to compete in the NFL today. And I think that that's a huge deal. Why don't you speak to that real quick before we move on to the next couple questions?
I think just generally the topic of analytics gets very bad press and has a stigma, but just if you just view analytics as having more numbers at your disposal, as you kind of said, that's really all it is. It's just trying to make better informed decisions based on the outcomes and the probabilities and putting yourself in the best position to succeed. And of course, yes, there are going to be times when the analytics, you make a decision using analytics and it doesn't go your way, but I think that's how the modern NFL is trending. That's why we're seeing so many more conversions and attempts on 4th down, and sometimes what would have been pretty taboo in previous years in the NFL, maybe even the mid-2010s, to go for it on 4th and 7 at your own 41-yard line in a certain situation, or to go for 2, as a guy like Dan Campbell has. Taking that same mentality and aggressive mindset into being a GM has very much paid dividends for a guy like Howie Roseman of Philadelphia or John Lynch of the 49ers. And I think Omar Khan, we're starting to see him start to do those types of things, being strategic and methodical, but being aggressive also. And I think we'll probably start to see that with the Steelers this upcoming draft. And that's why I don't think we're going to see Omar Khan give up way too much for a player that is not necessarily needed on a Steelers roster.
Yeah, I think Khan really has a good feel for the balance of it all. And that's important to me. And so we'll see how it plays out from here, but it is definitely a big change for Pittsburgh Steelers fans, and I think a welcome one for most. And there's going to be some that hang on to the old ways a little bit, but I think as you start to see some success here, and I would put the Steelers on an upward trajectory right now, even though there are some unknowns, I think that they're definitely, the arrow's pointing up. And we'll see how it all plays out. But when you're talking about providing Mike Tomlin with the units to improve and raise their floor to the point where now you've got a team maybe that obviously they've got a playoff floor, I think, like a playoff conversation floor. Now you add some players in there that bump that ceiling up maybe to a AFC championship type team that could get there, right? That could gel if they come together and really play to their best ability. Maybe that's a team where that's their ceiling. A division win is probably more realistic of a conversation. They're winning the AFC North. But I mean, still, obviously, you're probably a couple years away from actually competing for a Super Bowl. You've got to get this offense set up. You've got to get these players in, and you got to hope that Russell Wilson or Justin Fields becomes the guy for you. And we'll see how that all plays out. But I think that it's definitely arrow pointing up. Stock is up for the Pittsburgh Steelers right now, and this draft is going to have a lot to do with that as we get a little closer. Let's ask a final big question here, Bradley, on the topic of discussion here. If you are Omar Khan, let's give you your first 4 picks of this draft, okay? So you've got day 1 and day 2. You've got a first-round pick, a second-round pick, and 2 third-round picks. What positions are you targeting, Bradley, with those selections?
I do appreciate you gave me the higher tier picks instead of trying to make something happen on day 3. I like that. I think for me, the biggest position of need on the Steelers roster right now is center, as I talked about. And if Jackson Powers-Johnson of Oregon is there at pick 20, I think I'm sprinting in the pick card. He is so good. Really smooth mover out in space. He didn't have a ton of center experience out at Oregon, but he is probably the only center in this class I would feel comfortable taking in the first round, having watched Frazier and Van Pran. And I like Van Pran a good amount too. Frazier, I think I was a little more disappointed in the tape compared to the other two. But I think some people are averse to taking center in the first round. I would point to Tyler Linderbaum, has been phenomenal in the NFL since he came over from Iowa to the Ravens, and he is the centerpiece of that offensive line. Especially now having lost, I believe, 3 starters this offseason alone. And he's going to be there for 5 to 10 years and give you above average, if not really good center play. Creed Humphrey for the Chiefs has been really good and instrumental to that team's success and winning 2 straight Super Bowl titles. So I would
Marquise Pouncey, right?
Yeah, exactly.
In our own experience, Marquise Pouncey.
Yeah, but I think I'd have to probably try to go center with my first pick. Now, if Jackson Powers-Johnson goes at 18 or 19 or something like that, I'm probably going to try to pivot and go to either receiver or tackle. I think tackle, it's been shown that taking a tackle in the first round, it's not a position at which you should try to skimp. Usually the better tackles in the NFL are those that were higher pedigree overall, that were picked higher in the draft for a reason, because they have higher ceilings, they have better raw abilities, and just better overall skill sets. So I don't think tackle is an enormous need on the Steelers. I think that the Steelers should try to move away from Dan Moore Jr. at left tackle and try to put Broderick Jones back at his natural position at left.
Yes.
The good news is you do have Jones who can play right. And the good news is also the Steelers actually have 2 tackles who could start a football game. Right now, as I've said, there's nobody on this football team that I think could start at center right now. So you could go tackles. You talked about a guy like Guyton if he slips, or Taliese Fuaga from Oregon State. If he's somehow there, I would probably try to take him and pounce on him at 20, one of those tackles slipping. If not, I would probably go receiver. I think receiver at 20 or 51, as I said, needs to be one of the picks. I talked about Adonai Mitchell, Troy Franklin from Oregon, I would take at 51. I think he's kind of more of a Z, has some good acceleration, and is pretty good on vertical routes as well. Was pretty solid after the catch too. More as I talked about Brian Thomas Jr. And I still got to do a little more scouting work on a lot of those kind of tier 2 guys. But I think those would be my 3 positions. Also, cornerback should not be slept on. I'm guessing a guy like Terrion Arnold could definitely be in play at 20. I mean, the Steelers always have a lot of interest in Alabama type of players. Arnold is only 21, I believe. I'm not even sure if he is 21 yet. Really, really good run defender. Pretty solid in coverage too. Had a very good combine. Quinyon Mitchell probably will go a little bit before 20, but I wouldn't say that corner is an impossible pick. I think the Steelers have 2 corners who could at least start right now in Dante Jackson and Joey Porter Jr., but that's a room that definitely needs some upgrading, whether it's a free agent signing or a cornerback in the rounds of 2 to 4. I think cornerback should probably be in there. So I think my 4 picks in any order would probably be something like center, receiver, tackle, and quarterback, but I'm interested to see what you have to say.
Yeah, I'm gonna lean more towards the offensive tackle in round 1. And the other person that I would put in my conversation for center would be Graham Barton. Personally, I think that he can slide in there and be a solid starter there for you pretty quickly. I think you'd feel a little bit better though about Jackson Powers Johnson as your day 1 starter going in at center. So I would love it if Troy Faltanu or Amarius Mims were there at 20. I think those are 2 really good players. At 51, I think I'm going receiver. I think I match you there. If you've taken the offensive lineman early, I think I'm going receiver. Just to make sure that you have set up Russell Wilson and Justin Fields with as much as you can to be successful. Let's go offense early. A guy I really like, though, in the early 3rd round, maybe at that pick 84, maybe you trade up. I don't know what you would do with this, but I like Max Melton. I think that he's a really good player at corner. I think that he could be a target for them. So I'm going to say probably those 3 positions, and then whichever one you don't get in the 1st round, center or tackle. So I'm going to mirror you pretty much all the way. You get that other one in round 2 or 3. So I think in my latest mock draft for the Steelers, I had them trading back and taking Zach Frazier at the end of the 1st round, and then going receiver, tackle, and corner, and I think a linebacker too on day 3 to kind of boost the offense where you need it, and then fill in some of these spots where you're like, maybe next year, maybe the year after that, we're definitely gonna need somebody at this position, corner, and linebacker feel like that to me. I think defensive tackle you could put in that conversation as well for a day 2 pick. So we'll see how it plays out. I think that you're going to see a lot of movement in this draft, whether or not that's the Steelers making moves. I think the way that teams are going to target specific players and position groups is going to dictate the fell of this draft and how the Steelers make their picks, and they might get in on the moving around as well. Bradley, any final thoughts? Thanks for coming on. Go ahead and feel free to pitch anything you're working on for the website or anything like that, and we'll do a send off here.
Yeah, I think continuing doing a lot of scouting here on kind of, as I said, these tier 2 receivers. I think the Steelers could take it either 20 or 51. I'm going to watch Brian Thomas Jr. tonight, and I know Nick Farabaugh, kind of friend of the program, he said he's like a Martavis Bryant type, so that's always a really exciting comparison with his speed and size, so I'm excited to see what he can do on tape. And yeah, I think probably just kind of working on what positions. I think history tells us the Steelers usually go with the biggest position of need, and they don't really try to hide where they're going, like Kenny Pickett 2 years ago, Najee Harris 3 years ago, even Broderick Jones, it seemed like was kind of a very much could have been in play for the Steelers last year. So probably working on something like that, but very excited to continue churning out content here in the last few weeks until the draft.
Absolutely. And I'm sure you'll be a part of our draft coverage as we go around draft weekend. And I know we do some breaking news shows and try to incorporate a lot of our guys on the podcast side. So we'll look forward to seeing you on the podcast side again here shortly as well. And thank you for all the work that you do for the Steel Curtain Network. To all the listeners out there, go ahead and follow Bradley on X as well. Go ahead and give your X handle if you don't mind.
Just Bradley_Locker.
Okay, Bradley _ Locker. Go give him a follow. Good stuff there. And give me a follow at the Bets 93 THEBETZ 93, and we will keep bringing you all the content that you can handle here at the Steel Curtain Network. For Bradley Locker, I'm Jeremy Betts. We'll talk to you next time on the Steelers Q&A.